When I first bought the lake cabin, tucked away in the still woods that surrounded Crystal Pines Lake, I never thought I'd be dealing with the sort of small town politics and aggressive homeowners association shenanigans that belonged more to sensational news articles than real life. The property had been in my family for generations, a sturdy log cabin with wide porches, stone fireplaces, and enough history carved into its walls that it felt more alive than just lumber nailed together. And after inheriting it, I saw it as both a retreat and a responsibility, a place where my siblings, cousins, and parents could gather away from the noise of the cities where most of us worked, a kind of sanctuary where the air smelled of pine and freedom. But the minute the HOA, the so-called Crystal Pines Lake Preservation Committee, started sniffing around, I realized they had very different ideas about what ownership meant. The association had been founded decades ago when a few wealthy families wanted to create exclusivity around the lake, and while they pretended their goal was preserving the community, everyone knew they existed mostly to collect dues, enforce arbitrary rules, and bully anyone who resisted. At first, it was little things, letters shoved under my door, reminding me of community fees that had apparently been raised without my knowledge, then threats about landscaping violations when they didn't like the way I stacked my firewood, then some pompous committee members showing up uninvited to inspect my dock as though I needed their permission to fish off my own land, but I brushed it off because my family and I had a long history of ignoring petty tyrants. The irony was delicious, though. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly imagined, was that nearly everyone in my family worked for the federal government in some capacity, and not just desk jobs. My father had been in the Bureau for 30 years. My mother worked for Homeland Security. My sister and her husband were both with the Secret Service. My cousins were split between FBI, ATF, and Border Patrol, and I myself had spent 15 years in military intelligence before transferring to a federal investigations unit, meaning that if the HOA wanted a fight, they were unknowingly picking one with people who had spent their careers dismantling criminal organizations, infiltrating corrupt groups, and handling dangerous situations far more serious than cranky retirees. With clipboards, still, I didn't want trouble, so I paid the dues I knew were legitimate, ignored the absurd fees they tried to tack on, and focused on keeping the cabin in good repair. But then came the day I arrived at the lake after a 2-week trip and found rubble where the cabin had stood, the air still thick with dust, the smell of fresh sawn timber hanging in the breeze like the ghost of my family's memories, and a crooked sign hammered into the dirt reading, "Structure removed for non-payment of HOA fees. Property under review for compliance." I remember standing there with my fists shaking, every muscle in my body buzzing with disbelief because they hadn't just trespassed or sent a lien notice. They had demolished a home that had been in my bloodline for 3 generations, and they'd done it under the arrogant belief that I wouldn't fight back. The shock quickly hardened into a cold fury because in their smug little power play, they hadn't realized that I and the army of family behind me were professionals at fighting back legally, tactically, and strategically, and if they thought tearing down a cabin was going to scare me into paying their invented fees, they were about to learn exactly how catastrophic their mistake was. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos of the wreckage, recorded video of the debris field with their ridiculous sign in the middle, and sent a single message to the family group chat. They demolished it. Get ready. The family group chat exploded almost instantly after I sent the message, with replies flying in faster than I could even keep up, the screen scrolling so quickly that I had to stop recording the wreckage just to read. My father's calm, clipped text, confirmed destruction. Preserve evidence. Do not engage yet. My mother's fury bubbling through emojis she normally never used. Fire collision, pouting face, this will not stand. My sister from DC, writing, I'm booking flights now. They don't know what's coming. My cousin Tyler, who had spent years undercover with ATF, saying, treat this like organized crime, because that's what it is, and my brother-in-law Dan simply texting war. I stood in the ashes of our cabin, heart pounding, phone buzzing in my hand, and realized the HOA had unintentionally awakened a storm they couldn't possibly comprehend. Because for us, this wasn't just property damage. It was an attack on family, heritage, and principle, the kind of attack we were trained to counter with precision. Within an hour, a plan began forming, pieced together across encrypted calls and messages, because while the HOA thought they were a little neighborhood club with power to bully homeowners, We were quietly coordinating like the tactical unit we essentially were. My father reminded everyone to treat this by the book. We would gather evidence, establish chain of custody for documents, and pursue it legally first. But if the HOA escalated, we had contingencies. My mother began pulling up county property records and court filings, finding discrepancies almost immediately. Fake fee increases, fraudulent liens, signatures on documents that didn't match, things the HOA never thought anyone would bother checking, but to someone with her experience in Homeland Security fraud investigations, it was practically child's play. My sister used her contacts in the Secret Service's Cybercrime Division to dig into the HOA's financial accounts, and within hours she discovered money being siphoned into offshore accounts under the treasurer's name, with shell companies bouncing the funds through Belize and the Cayman Islands, which immediately reframed the situation. This wasn't just petty power-hungry neighbors, it was a laundering scheme hiding behind HOA paperwork, and by tearing down my cabin, they had given us the perfect opening to blow their entire operation apart. Tyler, meanwhile, reached out to a friend at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives who confirmed whispers about illegal weapon shipments being traced through rural communities, and suddenly the dots connected. The HOA wasn't just extorting homeowners, they were using the association as a front to launder cash, secure property for shell buyers, and move contraband without raising suspicion. Sitting in the dirt by the remains of my family's cabin, I could almost laugh at the sheer stupidity of it, because if they had left me alone, we might never have bothered looking this deep. But by targeting us, they had signed their own death warrant. When my family arrived 2 days later, it felt less like a reunion and more like the formation of a task force. SUVs pulling into the long gravel drive, cousins in tactical boots carrying duffel bags that definitely weren't just clothes, my sister barking into her phone as she walked toward me with the kind of stride that made junior agents scramble out of her way in DC, and my father stepping out last, his presence as commanding as ever even in civilian clothes, scanning the wreckage silently before putting a hand on my shoulder and saying, "Son, they just made the worst mistake of their lives." We spent hours in what remained of the cabin, literally setting up folding tables and laptops among the ashes like a forward operating base, mapping out everything we discovered so far, printing documents my mother had already pulled, stringing lines across corkboards that quickly began to resemble the kind of investigative webs you only see in war rooms, and with every new connection, the scope of the conspiracy became clearer. The HOA board members weren't just greedy retirees, they were connected to construction companies that specialized in demolition and compliance, which were in turn linked to shady contractors known for moving stolen goods across state lines, and at least two of the board members had suspicious travel records that lined up with known cartel shipments. The more we dug, the more it became obvious that my cabin wasn't destroyed over a missed $300 fee. It was destroyed because the HOA wanted that land, wanted control of every inch of lakeside property to expand their pipeline of illicit activities, and they thought bulldozing it would scare me into silence, not realizing that I came from a bloodline of people who eat intimidation tactics for breakfast. That night, as we huddled around lanterns and laptops with the cool lake air blowing through the skeletal remains of what had once been my porch, we finalized our strategy. We'd push legal pressure first, using every contact we had in federal law enforcement to ensure the county DA, sheriff, and courts couldn't sweep it under the rug. We'd simultaneously run surveillance on the HOA leadership, cataloging their movements, associates, and communications, gathering enough to hand over an airtight case to federal prosecutors. And if they caught wind of our investigation and tried to retaliate again, we had the manpower, training, and resources to counter it immediately. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation, because we all knew cornered criminals lash out, and these people were about to be very, very cornered. By the time the fireflies came out over the lake, the cabin no longer felt like a pile of broken wood, but like a staging ground for something much larger. And as I looked around at my family, federal agents, investigators, operatives, every one of them hardened by years of service, I knew with absolute certainty that the HOA had no idea what kind of war they had just declared. The first crack in the HOA's smug armor came faster than we expected, because only 3 days into our operation, while we were still running surveillance on their board members and quietly feeding evidence to federal contacts, a pair of their so-called compliance officers showed up at the ruins of the cabin, strutting in polo shirts with clipboards like they were untouchable, smirking at us as though we were squatters on our own land, and the arrogance in their voices was almost comical. When one of them announced, "This property has been seized by the Crystal Pines Lake Preservation Committee, and you are trespassing," I remember the way my sister froze mid-keystroke, then turned her head so slowly it was like watching a storm build, and the way my father calmly set down his coffee before standing to his full height, pulling out his badge, and saying in a voice that could silence a room, "No, gentlemen, you are trespassing on federal evidence." Their faces drained of color, but before they could stammer a response, two SUVs pulled up behind them, our cousins Tyler and Dan stepping out, both armed and wearing tactical gear that made it immediately clear we weren't just a group of angry homeowners, and the swagger those HOA enforcers had arrived with evaporated into panic. They tried to leave, babbling something about calling their president, but my mother blocked their path with a camera already rolling, demanding their names for the record. And when they refused, my brother-in-law leaned against their car door and informed them they weren't going anywhere until law enforcement arrived. It was at that moment they realized the tables had turned, because instead of us being intimidated by their authority, they were now the ones trapped with federal agents circling them like wolves around prey. By the time the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, clearly expecting to mediate a simple property dispute, he was met with half a dozen federal credentials shoved in his face, binders full of preliminary evidence, and two HOA officers caught lying on camera about their right to seize the land. The deputy's whole demeanor changed as he realized this wasn't neighborhood drama, it was a federal investigation in motion, and while he stammered about jurisdiction, my father smoothly explained that this was now a multi-agency matter and that the county sheriff's office had better not interfere unless they wanted to be complicit in obstruction. That encounter alone was enough to send shockwaves through the HOA, because within 24 hours of us detaining their little enforcers, the board president, a man named Gerald Whitmore, called an emergency meeting and began contacting members, warning them about dangerous outsiders threatening their community. But what Gerald didn't know was that Tyler had already bugged their meeting hall with surveillance equipment, and we listened from our makeshift base as they ranted about us, their voices dripping with entitlement and fear. Gerald pounding the table about how they couldn't let federal busybodies derail their operation, while the treasurer hissed that too much money was at stake to back down. Hearing them openly admit they were running an operation confirmed everything we suspected, and we recorded every word, time-stamped and backed up across multiple encrypted drives. It was the kind of evidence prosecutors salivate over. Still, the HOA wasn't going to roll over quietly. They doubled their security patrols, sent more compliance officers around the lake to intimidate homeowners, and even had the audacity to mail us fake cease and desist letters claiming we were interfering with lawful HOA business. But every step they took only built a stronger case against them, and the more desperate they became, the sloppier their mistakes. One night, around 2 a.m., my cousin spotted headlights creeping near the ruins of the cabin, and when we intercepted, we found 3 masked men trying to plant propane tanks with crude detonation devices, a pathetic attempt at arson or intimidation, but also a federal crime. And when we pulled off their masks, 2 of them turned out to be sons of board members, their college IDs still in their wallets. That incident was the breaking point for my father. He had tried to let this play out through evidence gathering, but attempted bombing of federal property was no longer a game, and he put out calls to his old contacts in the Bureau, activating resources we normally never pulled for something so local. Within 48 hours, unmarked vans began arriving in town, carrying specialists who set up discreet observation posts around the lake, drones overhead capturing every truck, every cash drop, every suspicious meeting the HOA conducted, and suddenly this sleepy lakeside community became the center of a full-blown federal sting operation. What struck me most during those weeks wasn't just the scope of the corruption we uncovered, but the arrogance of the HOA. They truly believed they were untouchable, that their network of county officials bought lawyers and fake bylaws insulated them from consequences, and even as our net closed tighter, Gerald kept boasting in meetings about how no one could touch them, how they'd been laundering money through property fees for 15 years, and no one had noticed how they could bulldoze anyone who stood in their way. It would have been pathetic if it weren't so infuriating, because these weren't just bullies, they were criminals hiding behind the veneer of community rules, and they had destroyed my family's history thinking they'd get away with it. But as we finalized the operation, it became clear to me that what had started as a personal vendetta was about to become something much larger, because by the time we were done, it wasn't just going to be about rebuilding the cabin, it was going to be about tearing down the entire rotten foundation of Crystal Pines Lake. And the best part? They still had no idea how close we were, how their every word and movement was already cataloged, how their empire was crumbling from within, and how the very family they had tried to intimidate was about to bring federal justice crashing down on their heads with the force of a hurricane. The day of the takedown dawned clear and quiet over Crystal Pines Lake, the kind of morning that made the glassy water look like a mirror and the pine trees sway gently as though mocking the storm that was about to break. Because while the HOA board members woke up thinking it was just another day of flexing their power over the community, my family and our allies were finalizing a coordinated strike that had been weeks in the making. The federal task force had already positioned itself around the neighborhood under the guise of utility trucks and delivery vans. Drones were humming silently overhead, feeding live video to laptops in our ash-covered command post, and our phones buzzed with encrypted updates from agents in the field, all of it converging toward the same goal: bring down the entire Crystal Pines Lake Preservation Committee in one clean sweep. My father stood at the center of it all, calm and collected, giving final instructions like the seasoned leader he was, while my sister and cousins relayed the digital evidence packets that would simultaneously be transmitted to federal prosecutors, the state attorney general, and the press once the arrests were underway. We weren't just dismantling a corrupt HOA, we were making sure the whole world knew the truth about what had been hiding behind the smiling facade of community preservation. When the signal finally came through, 3 short buzzes on our encrypted line, it was like watching a precision military operation unfold in real time. Federal agents in raid jackets swarmed the HOA headquarters, shattering the illusion of power the board had clung to for years, while others hit the homes and businesses tied to their laundering network, collecting hard drives, financial ledgers, and illegal weapons caches. Gerald Whitmore, the pompous president who had once sneered about bulldozing my cabin, was dragged out of his McMansion in handcuffs, sputtering about community rights, even as agents read him his charges: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, destruction of property, attempted arson, and more counts than his lawyer could ever hope to beat. I wish I could say I felt pity watching his empire collapse, but all I felt was vindication as I stood by the ruins of my cabin, listening over comms as report after report confirmed arrests, seizures, and confessions rolling in like dominoes falling. The treasurer broke almost immediately when confronted with offshore account records. The compliance officers flipped to avoid long sentences, and the younger members, those caught in the failed propane attack, sang like canaries once they realized their parents weren't powerful enough to save them. The sheriff's office, once cozy with the HOA, scrambled to distance itself, but not before evidence surfaced showing deputies had accepted bribes to ignore demolitions and harassment claims, and by the afternoon the county was swarming with investigators cleaning up a mess that had festered for more than a decade. Homeowners from all around the lake emerged from their cabins and houses, wide-eyed as they watched black SUVs and federal vans haul away the people who had lorded over them for years, and some of them even approached us in tears, thanking my family for doing what no one else had dared, standing up to the bullies who had extorted them into silence. It was in those moments I realized this was bigger than revenge for my cabin. It was about freeing an entire community that had been strangled by corruption. But even as justice was served, my family wasn't done, because the cabin itself still lay in ruins, and we all knew that rebuilding it would be the ultimate statement, that no matter how hard the HOA had tried to erase our history, we would return stronger. So as the dust settled, we rolled up our sleeves together, not just as federal agents, but as sons, daughters, cousins, and parents, hauling lumber, laying foundations, and restoring the log beams piece by piece, turning the site of our pain into a monument of resilience. Weeks later, as the new cabin stood proudly overlooking the lake, the scent of fresh wood mingling with the familiar pine-scented air, I gathered with my family on the porch under a sky painted in sunset hues, and we raised our glasses not just to the home we had rebuilt, but to the battle we had won, knowing that Crystal Pines Lake would never again be a place where petty tyrants held power unchecked. The HOA was gone, its leaders behind bars, its funds seized, and its bylaws dissolved by federal court order, and in its place was a community finally free to breathe. Neighbors who once lived in fear now waved as they boated across the water or strolled the dirt roads without harassment, and every time I looked at the new cabin, I remembered the moment I had first seen its ruins and how far we had come since then. In the end, the HOA had demolished more than just a building. They had demolished their own future by underestimating the one family they should have left alone, a family bound not just by blood, but by service, discipline, and an unshakable refusal to be intimidated. And as the fire crackled in the stone hearth of the rebuilt cabin that night, laughter filling the room, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The HOA had thought they were dealing with ordinary homeowners, but what they had actually done was declare war on a family of federal agents. And in that war, there was only ever going to be one winner.